Okay, so now we can begin to create the control chart for this question. Just a note, I'm using the data file that I made and provided with this presentation. In addition, I've added this table here so you can create your own table to input your data in however you want. I've also had these special notes so you can understand on what we're calculating and what it's used for. So step one for creating this control chart is you'll want to find the grand average and standard deviation for all our data points over here. But before we do that, I'm just going to fill in these fields right here. Starting with Sibley Hospital's average, you can use the average function, and I spelled average wrong. Here we go. So typical average function, you can drag and drop to get the rest of our averages for these time frames. We'll do the same thing with our DC competitors for each time period. So note that the time periods are from April 1st, 2015 to March 31st, 2016, and so forth for 4 different time periods. And you can drag and drop these two, but you have to be aware because you'll need to change the input values like so. Okay, so this is our basic information so far, and just looking on the surface right here, we can see that Sibley Hospital looks like it has better patient satisfaction scores on average compared to its DC competitors, but we'll let the control chart visualize that for us soon. Okay, now back to our first steps. We need to find the grand average and standard deviation for all the data points. So yeah, the grand average is the average of all the scores, including Sibley and the DC competitors. So I'll do equals average, and I'll highlight these cells, comma, and highlight all our data points for the DC hospitals as well, close parentheses, and there is our grand average for all the patient satisfaction scores for both hospital groups. Similarly, we want to find the standard deviation, so do standdev.s, which is for sample, and we'll highlight the same cells for that. And there's our standard deviation, or our grand standard deviation. Next, we'll want to find the standard deviation for each time period, which is denoted as ST. And for that, the equation to define that would be to take our standard deviation here and divide it by the number of scores in each time period. So there's about 6 scores in each time period, so you can either do standard deviation here divided by the square root of 6, or you can type in this equation here. So we'll highlight that cell, our standard deviation for all our points, divided by the square root, and like I said, you can do square root of 6 because that's how many data points you have in that time period, or you can use the count function as well if you have a bigger data set and there's too many points to count just on the top of your head. So we use that, close all these parentheses, and that will be 2.3 will be the standard deviation for this time period. And since there's 6 data points each time period, the equation will be the same, so it will be 2.3 for each time period here. But if you have, different number of data points in each time period, then you'll want to continually to put that equation back in, and you can drag and drop that too. But like I said, you'll need to change the location of these cells so you can get the correct standard deviation. So I'll do the same thing with these ones real fast. Whoops. And while I keep doing these equations and showing you how to do this, you can pause to do it yourselves or fast forward this presentation if you've already done these steps. Okay, so we got our grand average, we got our standard deviation, we got our standard deviations for all the time periods. Now we can begin to calculate our upper and lower control limits. So the equations for those I've noted right here. For the upper control limit, that will be our grand average plus 1.96 multiplied by the standard deviation of that time period. And just a side note, we use 1.96, that's a z-score. So going back to our statistics 101, when you look at that bell-shaped curve, the z-scores lined up on the the bottom of that bell-shaped curve. From the z-score negative 1.96 to a positive 1.96, that will comprise 95% of all the data. So that's why we use 1.96 in both these equations. So the calculation for the upper control limit, we're going to put equals our grand average plus 1.96 times the standard deviation of that time period, and that is our upper control limit for that time period. But since we'll have the same standard deviations for each time period, it will be 86.5 for each upper control limit for each time period. So I mean, if you want to drag and drop, but once again you have to move these time periods, or excuse me, we have to move these cells so you can get the correct control limit. Okay, same thing for the lower control limit. You're going to take the grand average, subtract it by 1.96 times the standard deviation of that time period, and that will be the same, and we know that the lower control limit will be the same for all. Okay, so now we've got all the necessary components to create our control chart. And what I like to also do with my control chart, and not all people do this with their control charts, is they like to put the grand average as like relative to our other averages, so you can see how they compare to the grand average. So I'm just going to copy, paste that. Oops, and you need to copy, paste special for that. And this will just create a reference line for our grand average on our control chart, which you'll see in a few moments. All right. So now that we have all the necessary data points, we can create our control chart. So I'm going to create a line graph. I'm going to select my data here. So normally I like to put in my upper and lower control limits in first. So we're going to add a series. I'll name this one UCL for upper control limit. Scroll that. That will be our data points for that. Do the same thing for our lower control limit. We'll name that series LCO for lower control limit. And highlight our data for our lower control limit. The horizontal axis, we'll want that as our date ranges. So edit and highlight our data ranges for that. So see, now we got with the dates on the bottom of our graph here. Okay, now we will add our Sibley average so we can see how that compares or where that falls along on our graph. Let's do Sibley average, highlight that, okay. And going back to what I was talking about, adding the grand average as a reference line, I'm going to put grand average, highlight that, okay. So that should be good for our data, and see that grand average line is right here, right in the middle of our upper and lower control limits, and that gray line right now is our Sibley average. And now we will want to format it the way that most control limits look like, so they'll make the upper and lower control limits as, you know, red, or will be red. So we will take the line, make that upper and lower control limit red. The same thing with the lower control limit, we'll make that red. For our Sibley average, we'll want some markers and to make it a different color so it can pop out. Format the data series. Let's go to markers. Marker options. Let's do built-in. I like to use a diamond. Doesn't matter what you use. And we'll need to fill. We'll make it blue. I think we'll need to make the border blue as well. And we'll make the line blue. Okay, so now we got the correct formatting for our Sibley average line and our control limits. For a grand average, I like to make that just noticeable, so I don't want it to pop out too much. So I'll make that light gray, and a dash, so we know it's our grand average. And as well, we'll add access titles, chart titles. As I say again, it's hard to talk and present this all at the same time, so if I'm going too fast or I'm going too slow, yeah, feel free to pause or fast forward in this presentation. This is one of the first times I've been doing one of these live demonstrations, so having a little troubles, but we'll get by. Okay, so back to our presentation. Our chart title, we'll just put Sibley versus DC competitors, patient satisfaction. You can format these charts or label these charts however you want. This is just how I'm doing it. So our vertical axis will be our patient score, or patient satisfaction score. And horizontal will be date range, where they got these values. And if you want, you can add a legend so you can see what it is we're looking at. And I'll make this chart a little bigger so we can see it better. Okay. And that right there is the answer to our question. We create a control chart that can visualize the patient satisfaction scores between our Sibley Hospital and DC competitors. Looking at this control chart, you can see that the patient satisfaction level at Sibley Hospital is above the grand average for all our DC hospitals and really close to the upper control limit. So compared to its DC competitors, Sibley's doing very well.